me the story of Jesus, write on thy heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read while you whisper, love in the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Okay, this morning I want to bring a message on. Well, we'll start with Halloween and then we'll continue on as the year progresses, because we're coming into what's termed the holiday season. You can already tell because there's decorations in all the department stores, and this is that time of the year that every year we have to deal with this. You know, there was a video that Elder Mott sent me a couple of weeks ago of a Catholic priest and a homily. I guess that's what they call a sermon in a Catholic church, in which he basically warned everyone in his congregation that if they voted for a particular candidate in an election, in this upcoming election, who is very vocal about being pro-abortion, that they could not take communion in his church because they were enabling someone to murder children. It was an excellent homily. No, that would be grits. A homily, and he made very good very good argument. And one of the things that he said is found over here in Ezekiel. Let me find it here real quick, because I just now happened to think of this. Ezekiel chapter 33 verse 7 says, "So thou, O son of man, I have set thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore thou shalt hear the word at my mouth, and warn them from me. When I say unto the wicked, O wicked man, thou shalt surely die, if thou dost not speak to warn the wicked from his way, that wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thine hand. Nevertheless, if thou warn the wicked of his way to turn from it, if he do not turn from his way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul." And that's part of what this is about. He used that verse to warn the people about who they might vote or not vote for in an election. I'm using that verse to warn the people that you should not be involved in these holidays. And so I'm sending the warning out, and I am delivering my soul from any problems if people seem that they want to ignore it. If they want to go do this and they end up punished as a result of it, well, at least I'm clear. I don't have to take the punishment for you. Okay? That's part of the reason for this. We have gotten to a point to where people don't think of Halloween. I mean, on the way to church this morning, we drove by a Baptist church that had, what was it, fall festival signs or something, advertising for their festival, which will be held this weekend and tomorrow. We've seen pumpkin patches in all kinds of different churches. I even saw a church on the way to the dry cleaners the other day where they were holding up signs with Halloween written on them in front of a church. And of all the holidays, I don't see how in the world anybody can associate this with good. I mean, Halloween? Really? Now, what I want to do is go through some things that I've already covered most of this with you before. We've talked about this before, so you're not going to hear very much that's new. I do have some quotes from some sources that I'm going to share with you that I haven't shared before that I think will be telling. And for those that wonder, well, but what do we do on this day? Go do something else. You know what? Take your wife out to dinner. Go do something else. Get out of the house. Don't be there. Turn the lights off. Be done with the whole thing and do something else. Share the time with your family doing something that has absolutely nothing to do with this holiday, and go home at 10 o'clock, and at 10 o'clock at night it's all over with anyway. So there's the beginning. There's your answer as to what to do. Now we're going to show you why you don't do what everyone else is doing. I want you to turn first to Psalms chapter 119. Because this is extremely important in everything that we do, but especially when it comes to these types of things. Psalm chapter 119, we're going to begin at verse 97. Where we read, "Oh, how I love thy law. It is my meditation all the day. Thou, through thy commandments, hast made me wiser than mine enemies, for they are ever with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for thy testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the ancients, because I keep thy precepts. I have refrained my feet from every evil way, that I might keep thy word. I have not departed from thy judgments, for thou hast taught me. How sweet are thy words unto my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through thy precepts I get understanding. Therefore I hate every false way. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path." We need to understand and remember that what we think is not necessarily truth. That truth comes from the Scripture. And the standard for practice for a Christian particularly is the Word of God. What God tells us to do, we are to do. What He tells us not to do, we are to not do. And that's the standard. It's not our personal feelings. It's not our emotions. It's not what somebody else tells us is fun. That is not the standard by which we are to follow. We are to follow the Word of God. In Acts chapter 26, we have an account of the Apostle Paul talking to King Agrippa. And he says something very interesting. In Acts chapter 26, verse 9, he says, "I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, and when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them." I want you to consider something for a moment. The Apostle Paul was killing Christians because he thought it was the right thing to do. Was it? Was what he thought the right thing to do when he was shutting up Christians in prison and giving his voice to their death? We're talking about the Apostle Paul. If he can make that kind of a mistake, how many mistakes do you think we can make? We can't base what we do on what we think. We have to have a standard that we can look at that's outside of ourselves, something that we can trust, and if it disagrees with what we think, then we have to change what we think, not try to change the Word as the way it's written. Turn also to Proverbs chapter 28. Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 26 says, "He that trusteth in his own heart is a fool." He that trusteth in his own heart is a fool. But whoso walketh wisely, he shall be delivered. So we cannot decide that because we think it's okay, it is therefore okay. Turn to Matthew chapter 7. Because the other thing that we always hear is, well, everybody else does it. It must be okay. Everybody else does it. The whole world can't be wrong. Everybody does it. Why can't we do it? Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 says, "Enter ye in at the strait gate. For wide is the gate." Straight, that means narrow. That means very, very compacted. The strait gate, not straight as in a line, but very, very narrow. "Enter ye at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." Look around the room. Few there be that find it. Why are there few that find it? Because most enter into the broad gate, where everybody says, well, everybody else does it. It must be okay. The majority thinks it's fine, so we'll just go ahead and do it. And that's the wrong answer. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 3. And that is always one of the things I remember Elder Mott saying many years ago was that one of the worst things you can possibly do is find a church that you like and join it and be a member of it for the rest of your life. Because if you choose it based on what you think, you're going to end up in the wrong church. It's that simple. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20 says, "Which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a-preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water." The entire world was wrong, with the exception of 8 people, Noah and his family, and they received the temporal salvation of being able to live in this world when everybody else was completely wiped out. You can't bank on others being right if you're not standing on God's word. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, we read, "By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith." So you see, we cannot trust the idea that if the majority does something, that it must be right. We have to base our decisions upon the Word of God, whether it's the right thing or not. I heard someone one time say that the man that stands all by himself for something at least stands for something. And those that just run with the crowd, in many cases, they don't stand for anything. Because it's easier just to run with the crowd than it is to stand for something that you know is right and that you should stand for. Turn to Acts chapter 17. Beginning at verse 18. You know, in this day and age, we have gotten to a point where celebrating holidays is normal. And so someone like me comes along and says you shouldn't do it, and that seems new. That seems strange. That seems, well, that can't be right because everybody else does it. What do you mean that's new? That's something we haven't heard before. Don't think that just because it's new to your ears, it's therefore wrong. Okay? And that's the point that we want to make here. Acts chapter 17, verse 18 says, "And Paul, after this, tarried there a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren and sailed thence." Is this the right place? No, I'm in the wrong chapter, aren't I? Acts chapter 17 and verse 18. Then certain philosopher, there we go, of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, "What will this babbler say?" Others, some, "He seemed to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him unto the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is?" You see, when the Apostle Paul was preaching the gospel, that was something new to people. They hadn't heard that before. So just because somebody comes and brings you something that's different than what you've heard before does not necessarily mean it's wrong. It might absolutely be right. How do you know? By the standard that we read about in Psalms chapter 119. That's how you know. You be like the Bereans, that were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily whether those things were so. You always search the scriptures daily, because you know what, folks? I can make a mistake. Other men can make a mistake. We can make an error. We're not perfect. None of us. We are not inspired men as apostles were. We can make a mistake. And if you search the scriptures and find we made a mistake, then show us where we made our mistake, please. Because we can goof too. So this is not just a command for you to go out to do this for your own benefit, but also to help your pastor and anyone else that stands up and is teaching. Because if we get off the path and nobody's, one of the things that's Charles Spurgeon talked about this, and I know I'm chasing a rabbit now, but he talked about the fact that the higher you get, one of the worst things you can ever do is put a man on a pedestal, stick him up there on a pedestal like he's some sort of a god, because the farther up the ladder someone gets, the less advisors that person has. And you can get to the point to where you stick him up there too high. Please don't do that to me. I don't think you will, because I don't think I deserve to be up there. But please don't stick me up there, because when you get there, all of a sudden there's nobody that's willing to go talk to you and tell you that you made a mistake. Nobody's willing to advise you anymore. And I don't want that. I want you to always be able to, at least if you've got Bible verses, bring them to me and show me. If I'm getting off track, I need to know. But if I've got the Bible verses and they're right, then by God, you better live by them. Because if I read it out of the book and what you find is exactly what's there, then you better pay attention, because all I'm doing here is reading what God is telling you. That's simple, okay? Another thing that we have to remember, over in Genesis chapter 6, you can remember I'll call your mind to remember one of the things that Eve thought when the serpent came to her. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6 says, "And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat." Just because something might seem pleasant does not mean that it's something you should do. In fact, Satan hides all of his deceptions by draping them with righteousness. He tries to sell people on the idea that what he is doing is ultimately righteous. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 13 says, "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works." That's what he does. He tries to trick God's children. it's real easy to see the debauchery out there and understand that, yeah, that's probably not right. That's simple enough to tell. But what about the guy that shows up in the robe with the collar and all the rest of the stuff and is preaching Jesus? You see, that's it's an interesting thing. I mean, when you think about it, Christ being in control to the point where Satan had to actually start forming a counterfeit religion in order to stay in business. That he couldn't sell Satanism enough anymore, that he had to adopt Jesus' name just in order to stay in business and have a religion that he could. I mean, that kind of shows that somebody's in control of things, doesn't it? But you see, he's always done that. He is the great deceiver. In Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9, it says, "In that the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world." Don't be surprised if at one time or another in your life you have not been deceived. And don't be surprised if in the future you might run into something that might tend to try to deceive you again. Because we are all fallen human beings, and we tend toward that. And Satan knows us better than you can imagine. He's a lot smarter than all of us. He was the highest created being at the time, and he fell. Pretty smart dude. Don't think you can outsmart him. And he will send things in a way to try to ease it up and try to trick you. That's what he does, and that's what we have to be careful of. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 12. This is not something that has ever been hidden. This is something that's right out in the open and always has been. When we deal with holidays, especially religious holidays, as my father in the ministry used to always say, the problem with religious holidays is that they're religious. That's the problem with them. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 29 says, "When the Lord thy God shall cut off the nations from before thee, whether thou goest to possess them, and thou succeedest them and dwellest in their land, take heed to thyself, that thou be not snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before thee, and that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, How did these nations serve their gods? Even so I will do likewise. Thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God, for every abomination to the Lord which he hateth have they done unto their gods. For even their sons and their daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. Thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish from it." This was not a secret, that God is not honored by people getting involved in pagan practices. Look at Jeremiah chapter 10. Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. "Hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, Learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain." You know what vain means? It means it's worthless. Just absolutely worthless. "For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold, they fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not." Just worthless. Idolatry. Stupid, worthless idolatry. Fashioning things out of trees that you cut out of the wilderness. Turn to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 7 says, "But when ye pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. Be not ye therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things you have need of before you ask Him." You know, there are so many religions. I remember Joshua brought me a set of prayer beads from Turkey one time, because I guess Muslims do the same kind of a thing. And Catholics, they have their rosary with all the little beads on them, so they can keep track of how many times they've said whatever it is, this repetitious prayer that they say over and over and over and over and over. Those are pagan practices, folks. And Christ just defined it right here in Matthew. Don't do that. Don't look at what these other religions do and decide that we're going to do the same thing because that looks cool. Well, let's do it that way. And so many have done exactly that. Look at Romans chapter 12. Verses 1 and 2. "I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Do not be conformed to this world. You've got to live in this world, but you don't have to conform yourself to it. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Verse 14. He just flat out says it here. "Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry." You know, one of the interesting things about humans is that this is one of those areas that we will tend to go to. They say it over and over and over and over again about the idolatry. Look at the nation of Israel all the way down through time. What do they keep drifting back into? They kept drifting back into idolatry. They just kept going there. Now I've got some messages that I'm working on that I'll bring eventually that will be titled "Why We're Not Primitive Baptists," and some of that is going to lead into that because again of the holidays. I want to show you where a lot of this idolatry actually leads to, because I think in the future we're going to end up seeing us going right back to it again. We're already headed that way on a fast train to hell, so to speak, But that's one of the issues, that and fornication, and the two go hand in hand. And so I want you to picture something with me for a moment. You know, I had a friend one time that told me that there was a reason that God had the Jews circumcised, and so that way you could spot one in the pile. And when they would have one of these pagan religious ceremonies, which was an orgy, which is what their religion was about. Go take a look at, if you're ever in one of these, a museum that has artifacts from that part of the world, go look at some of those statues, the ones that they found around the temples. You will be astonished. There's not a magazine on planet Earth that shows some of the things that you see on statues that were around temples. Okay? That's what God sees. When your little kid walks up and knocks on a door and says trick or treat, that's what God sees. That's what's so abhorrent to Him, because He's taking part in a festival designed for that filth. Now, that may not be what He's thinking, and it may not be what you're thinking, and it may not be what anybody else is thinking. But it doesn't matter what you think. What matters is what God said. So remember that. It's extremely important. God is not to be worshiped that way. Turn to 2 Corinthians in chapter 6. Beginning at verse 14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. Think about that for a minute. Your body is the temple of, you're one of the stones in the temple of God if you're a child of God. Ye are the temple of the living God, as God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. We're not to be conformed with this stuff, and God absolutely abhors taking His religion and having His people get involved in idolatrous practices. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 21. 1 Corinthians 10:21 says, Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? That sound like a good idea? Are we stronger than He? And finally, Galatians chapter 4 and verse 8. Howbeit then, when we knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. Think back prior to your conversion and what you did then. But now after ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto you desire to be in bondage? Ye observe days and months and times and years. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. The Apostle Paul was actually afraid that here he had wasted his time by going there and preaching the gospel, because before you know it, these people are drifting right back into the same crap he pulled them out of. And that's the fear that every minister that stands in front of you has every day of his life, that the people that he has worked so hard with will drift right back into what they came out of. And even if you're sitting there thinking, no, that could never happen, look around the room again. Look at the people that we've had that were members of this church that have gone right back into where they came from. There have been enough. At this point in time, there's been enough for you to understand that it can happen to you too if you take your eyes off of God's Word. And you start thinking, well, I think this or I think that. If you ain't got Bible to stand on it, you know, maybe it's okay to think the Packers are going to win the Super Bowl, and you might be right, they might do it. But don't go there on a Sunday and bow down to them. Don't turn that into an idol. And don't think that God's going to let you get away with doing things that He clearly says not to do. In Exodus chapter 32, we have the story of the golden calf. Here Moses had been gone, hadn't even been gone 40 days yet. And they'd already given up on the guy. And in Exodus 32, it says, And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. And Aaron said unto them, break off the golden earrings which are in your ears of your wives, of your sons, and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron, and he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made a molten calf. And they said, these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. This molten calf is the God that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Well, who was the God that brought him up out of the land of Egypt? It was Jehovah. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. This is a feast to Jehovah. These people were intending to worship Jehovah by using a molten calf. Okay? They were taking a pagan practice and trying to use a pagan practice in order to worship God. And how often have you heard people say, well, we know it came from paganism, but we're just trying to worship God in it. Well, that's what these folks were doing. It's exactly what the people in the wilderness were doing. They were trying to worship God by using pagan practices. Verse 6, and they rose up early on the morrow, and offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat, and to drink, and rose up to play. So we know what they were doing. What do you think God thought of that? Was that accepted by God? Did he think that was a good idea? I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 5 through 7. But with many of them God was not well pleased. Well, that ought to tell you right there. For they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And he's talking about the children in the wilderness, the very ones that made the molten calf and tried to worship God through pagan practices. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. They were trying to worship God by adopting a pagan practice. God said they were practicing idolatry. So when you get the inkling, well, maybe we can adopt some of it, no. If you don't have a verse saying you can adopt some of it, you can't adopt some of it. Not without facing the judgment of God. These people died in the wilderness, by the way, remember that. Attaching Christian names and symbols to pagan practices does not make them Christian. You can put as many names on them as you want to. Something else I think that people need to remember, and that is, turn to Proverbs chapter 8. Sin is not to be trifled with. Proverbs chapter 8. And verse 13 says, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogancy and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate. Somebody that loves sin does not fear the Lord. Somebody that trifles with sin does not fear the Lord, at least when it comes to that particular point. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, to loathe it. Psalms chapter 119. We hear David in verse 158. Psalm 119, 158. Says, I beheld the transgressors and was grieved because they kept not thy word. David was grieved when he saw other people breaking God's law. Wasn't just himself that it bothered him to see others doing it. This is not something that we should just play with or think that it's not that big of a deal, or we'll do it for the children's sake, or whatever excuse you want to come up with. Sin is not something to be trifled with. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 32, we read, "Who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them." And this is a description of people that have drifted into sin. Not something to be looked at and thought, well, it's not that big of a deal. It may not be that big of a deal to a fallen human being, but it's a big deal to an almighty holy God. Romans chapter 12 and verse 9 says, "Let love be without dissimulation. Abhor that which is evil. Cleave to that which is good." Now let's get to this idea of the holiday that's going to hit tomorrow called Halloween. It's celebrated on October 31st. We know that. The word Halloween is a shortened form of All Hallow Even. It's the eve of All Hallows or All Saints Day. Okay? November 1st was set aside by the Catholic Church as All Saints Day to commemorate all the saints who are in heaven. And November 2nd is All Souls Day, which is set aside for those who have died but have not yet reached heaven. In other words, those that are in purgatory. If there's anyone in the room that's, and I know there are some former Catholics in the room, you can verify that this is what this is. Okay? For those of you that have a concordance, when you get home today, look up All Saints Day, and look up All Souls Day, and look up All Hallow Even, and see if you can find it in the Bible. The Bible knows nothing of these holidays. Absolutely nothing of them. There is no specific day set aside to light candles for souls that are in purgatory. And all of this is tied into that. All Saints Day, now this comes from the Catholic Encyclopedia. I'll be paraphrasing some of it, but I got this from the Catholic Encyclopedia. All Saints Day is a solemn holy day of the Catholic Church, celebrated annually on November 1. The day is dedicated to the saints of the Church, that is, all those who have attained heaven. That sounds almost like works, doesn't it? If you've attained it, that sounds almost like works. It should not be confused with All Souls Day, which is observed on November 2 and is dedicated to those who have died and not yet reached heaven. So I guess you can work your way into heaven even after you're dead? Or maybe somebody can work for you by buying indulgences. You know, it was the idea of selling indulgences so that they could complete the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel. When they were selling those indulgences and things really got out of hand, that was one of the things that brought about the Protestant Reformation. The idea that you can buy somebody else into heaven? Where's that in the Bible? Although millions or even billions of people may already be saints, All Saints Day observances tend to focus on known saints. That is, those recognized in the canon of the saints by the Catholic Church. Members of the Eastern Orthodox Church, as well as some Protestant churches, such as the Lutheran and Anglican churches, also commemorate All Saints Day. Generally, All Saints Day is a Catholic holy day of obligation, meaning all Catholics are required to attend Mass on that day unless they have an excellent excuse, such as a serious illness. Did you know that? I don't think it's practiced here in the States as much as it is in some other countries, but that's That's one of their rules. It says other countries have different rules according to their national bishops' conferences. The bishops of each conference have the authority to amend the rules surrounding the obligation of the day. So the preacher gets to decide whether or not you're going to show up on that day or not. Yeah, that's in the Bible, right? We get to make the rules. That's in First Catholic chapter 3 and verse 6. Is that? Okay, Pope Boniface IV, who consecrated the Pantheon at Rome to the Virgin Mary and all the martyrs, formally started All Saints' Day on May 13 in 609 AD. Boniface IV also established All Souls' Day on May 14th, which follows All Saints' Day. Now, I was not a math major, okay? I will admit I'm not really good at math, but the Apostle John, the last of the apostles, passed away somewhere around 90 AD. And when he wrote the book of Revelation, in somewhere we believe around 90 AD, the Bible was finished, okay? Pope Boniface comes up with something in 604 AD. Now, I think that's close to, or a little over 500 years later than the Bible was written. Which means there's no biblical support for something that came along a half a millennium later. And yet that's where this stuff came from. The choice of the day may have been, this is out of the Catholic Encyclopedia. The choice of the day may have been intended to co-opt the pagan holiday Feast of the Lemurs, a day which pagans used to placate the restless spirits of the dead. Have we not read, don't look to other religions and ask them, how do they celebrate their gods, and we'll do likewise? And they admit that this holiday came straight out of paganism. Pope Gregory III eventually established the holy day on November 1st in the mid-8th century as a day dedicated to the saints and their relics. The May 13th celebration was subsequently abandoned. In Ireland, the church celebrated All Saints' Day on April 20th to avoid associating the day with the traditional harvest festivals and pagan feasts associated with Samhain celebrated at the same time. You see, the Irish Catholics knew that around November 1st, there was this big pagan festival that went on. So let's move the date to April so that we're not going to coincide. We don't want to make it look like we're adopting this thing and taking some pagan holiday and adopting it into something else. So they moved the date for that reason. Following the establishment of the Frankish Empire and following the reign of Charlemagne, the Holy Day, which was already celebrated on November 1st, became a holy day of obligation by decree of Pope Gregory IV and Louis the Pious, who was king over a portion of Charlemagne's former empire. Following the Protestant Reformation, many Protestants retained the holy day, although they dismissed the need to pray for the dead. Instead, the day has been used to commemorate those who have recently died, usually in the past year, and to remember the examples of those who lived holy lives. Holy Day customs vary around the world. In the United States, the day before is Halloween, and is usually celebrated by dressing in costumes with themes of death commonly associated. Children go door to door in costume, trick-or-treating, that is, soliciting candy from their neighbors. The holiday has lost much of its connection to the religious origins. No, rather what we're doing is teaching our children to go door to door and beg for food from their neighbors without doing anything other than putting on a costume and scaring them if they don't give us food. That's a wonderful example, don't you think, to teach people to go out there and get what somebody else earned by scaring them out of it? That's a good thing to do, yeah. We'll do it for the children. Although nearly everyone celebrates Halloween for the fun of the secular holiday, the following religious solemnity is not widely practiced or acknowledged by most Americans unless they're Catholic. In other countries, such as Portugal, Spain, and Mexico, traditional practices include performance of the play Don Juan Tenero and offerings made to the dead. All Saints' Day occurs on the same day as the Mexican Dia de los Inocentes, a day dedicated to deceased children. Pardon my destroying the Mexican language or the Spanish language here. Across much of Europe, the day is commemorated with offerings of flowers left on the graves of the dead. In Eastern Europe, candles are lit on graves instead of offerings of flowers. In some places, such as the Philippines, graves can be painted and repaired by family members. Many of these practices, wow. Many of these practices blur the distinction between All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. All Saints' Day is properly dedicated to those who are in heaven, and All Souls' Day is a day to offer prayers to those who have died but have not yet reached heaven. So the Catholics are complaining that they're blurring some of their holidays together. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead Holy Days extends from October 31st through November 2nd. And you've probably seen all the little skulls that go along with that holiday. Now, this is from the Catholics. It says it's important to remember these three basic facts. Halloween is a secular holiday that comes the night before All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day is on November 1, and it is a holy day of obligation. All Souls' Day is on November 2nd, and it is not a holy day of obligation. So you don't have to go to Mass 2 days in a row. You only have to go on November 1st, okay? Now, that was the Catholics. Now let's go look at some other things. The earliest Halloween was actually held long before Christian times by the pagan Celtic priests that were known as Druids in honor of Samhain, the Lord of the Dead. We mentioned Samhain a little bit. The Catholics mentioned it. Remember the part about the Irish didn't want to attach that holiday to around the end of November because it might be then associated with the Samhain character. So they changed the date to April 20th. That we read in the Catholic deal, okay? The Samhain, this festival was held at the end of the harvest season, and it was called Samhain, and it was the equivalent of the Celtic New Year. So if you lived in Scotland or Ireland or one of the other Celtic areas, Wales, and you practiced this, your New Year fell around this time of the year. It was during this time that people would slaughter livestock, take inventory of other supplies, and prepare for the winter, just like agricultural people have always done. Okay? These duties were religiously followed. This was religion to these people. It was believed that October 31st was when the separation between the living and the dead disappeared, and those who were living were potentially subject to sickness, infant death, or damaged crops caused by the spirits of the dead. So these festivals were a way of entertaining the spirits to prevent any such tragedies. That's where this stuff came from. Bonfires were a common practice throughout these festivals, as it believed that it helped the spirits find their way to the villages. It was on these fires that the bones of the slaughtered animals were thrown to fuel the flames. The people believed that the evil spirits could be pacified by both the fires and by the costumes and masks of animal heads and skins that were worn by the participants. Okay? The popularity of this type of festival began to increase and was adopted by many of the different pagan cultures throughout Northern Europe. The Roman Catholic Church then adopted Halloween, which was typical of their practice with other holidays. You see, this is all going back to something that somebody else started. And what did we read? Don't do something. Don't look at the way people worship their God and then do that to me. And that's exactly what has been going on. The popularity of Halloween became a holiday in the United States when Irish immigrants introduced it to American culture in the 19th century. That's when Halloween got here. In the 19th century, that would be the 1800s, when we had a huge influx of Irish immigrants. Now, look, I'm not picking on the Irish, okay? Irish and Scottish are like this, so I'm not picking on Irish folks, but Irish are Celtic, and these celebrations got their beginning amongst Celtic people. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland experienced a monumental famine known as the potato famine. And during this time, more than 1 million Irish died because of the famine, and another 1 million immigrants came to America. And with them, they brought this holiday. And it started to drift into American culture as a result of that. As the decades passed, costumes became more popular, first appearing in stores in the 1930s. Trick-or-treating took place in the American celebrations in the 1950s. And since then, the holidays activities, they're becoming more and more, we were talking about this in the car on the way to church this morning, they're becoming more and more adult. Trick-or-treating isn't what it was. I think, let's see, last year were we home last? I think we were at home last year, and I don't think anybody even knocked on the door. Now, of course, all the lights were out. We had towels over the front door and all the shades pulled and cars all parked in the backyard somewhere, so it absolutely looked like nobody was home. I don't know if that could have had anything to do with it, but no one came around. So I don't know, and you'll have to think about your own neighborhoods. You know, we've talked to others that said much the same way. It's just not. It's becoming again more of an adult type of a thing, and with parties. Wendy made the point that we come from the generation we come from is all about themselves anyway, and most of the baby boomers never wanted to grow up, and so they've just taken the holiday over for themselves. But the holiday itself was never authorized by God and was adopted from paganism. Now, let's talk about the Church of Satan for a minute, because we know Satan does not wear a white hat. That much we know. We know that he is the bad guy, right? And we know that he has a church that's actually labeled the Church of Satan. So I'm not talking now about false religion in the form of Christianity. I'm talking about the Church of Satan. This comes directly from the Church of Satan. You can find it on their webpage if you are so inclined to look. There are under frequently asked questions relative to holidays, I'm going to read the question and the answers directly from the Church of Satan. Okay, so you can hear what it has to say. Okay, because you see, they still observe this. The Church of Satan is involved in this one. Question: what holidays do Satanists celebrate? And as I read this, tell me if this doesn't sound like what we hear over in Timothy, where it says that perilous times shall come, in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves. Tell me if this doesn't sound a lot like that. Since Satanism is a self-centered religion, The highest holiday of the year would be the Satanist's own birthday, which needs no ritual, but should be spent in doing things a Satanist would enjoy. There is no requirement that a Satanist celebrates any holidays, and there are no hard and fast traditions or rites associated with them. Since Satanism embraces nature, the other embraces nature, the other holidays a Satanist might choose to celebrate would be the seasonal turning points marked by the equinoxes and solstices, the dates of which vary from year to year, as well as the midpoints between which these can be recognized as the climaxes of each season. What does that sound like? What holidays does that sound like? All of the religious ones? April 30th, called, I can't pronounce this, Walpurgisnacht. Sorry, not a Satanist. Don't know how to say it. Big, long, looks like a German name. Is the spring climax and the anniversary of the founding of the Church of Satan, and is generally noted. Halloween, October 31st, is the fall climax and may be celebrated as a time when one's inner self might be explored through the use of a costume, or one might recall those of importance in one's life who have died, as was done on that night in European tradition. The next question, now I know this doesn't deal with what we're talking about today, but this was question number 2, and I thought it was interesting, so I put it in here, and that is, what about the Christmas holiday? Okay? As Christians stole this holiday from the pagans, now this is from the Church of Satan, they might know, okay? As Christians stole this holiday from the pagans, Santa Claus has come to signify indulgence, and he is a combination of a couple of other names that I don't want to try to destroy from Roman and Greek myths. The Romans celebrated the orgastic Saturnalia at this time. The Nazarene has little place in the general public celebration of this season. Well, they keep saying, to put Christ back in it. Christ was never in it to start with. Which were meant by pagans to be celebrations of abundance during a season of cold and emptiness. So for the Yule holiday season, we enjoy the richness of life and the company of people whom we cherish, as we will often be the only ones who know where the traditions really came from. Okay? The third question. Is Halloween important to Satanists? We see this holiday as the night when the mundane folk try to reach down inside and touch the darkness, which for the Satanist is a daily mode of existence. Particularly in the United States, Halloween is a time for celebrating monster films, wearing costumes of a macabre nature, and invoking the thrill of fun fear. Children of all ages can indulge their fantasies by donning costumes that allow for intense role-playing and the release of their demonic cores, the parts of their personalities often hidden from their friends, co-workers, and family. Though there are traditions making this an occasion for recalling the dead, it has been popularized as a time to play with what historically were fears directed towards what were thought to be unquiet spirits of the departed. And the grand traditional question, trick or treat, has become a means for fulfilling an indulgence in sweets without the need to resort to the optional coercion. Satanists embrace what this holiday has become and do not feel the need to be tied to ancient practices. This night we smile at the amateur explorers of their own inner darkness, for we know that they enjoy their brief dip into the pool of the shadow world. We encourage their fantasies, the candid indulgence, and the wide-ranging evocation of our aesthetics, while tolerating some of the chintzy versions, even if it is but once a year. For the rest of the time, when those not of our meta tribe shake their heads in wonder at us, we can point out that they may find some understanding by examining their own All Hallows Eve doings. But we generally find it simpler just to say, think of the Addams family, and you'll begin to see what we're all about. Sound like a Christian holiday? Does this sound like something sanctioned by God? No, of course not. It never was. Now, you know, there was a reason that years ago there were the Salem witch trials. There was a reason for that. You know what the reason was? Because they found some witches. Evil spirits, devils, demons, witches. These are not fantasy, people. These are a reality. This stuff exists. There are devils, there are demons, there are witches, there are evil spirits. And we shouldn't be playing around with them. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, beginning at verse 9, we read, "When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because of these abominations the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God, for these nations which thou shalt possess hearkened unto observers of times and unto diviners, but as for thee, the Lord thy God hath not suffered thee to do so." Look at Galatians chapter 5. And verse 19. "Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like." Do I have to repeat that? Drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I have also told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Look at Revelation chapter 16. And verse 13. "And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils, working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth, and to the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty." You see, these things are real. They're not fantasy. So we shouldn't be acting like them. And we shouldn't be trifling with them. And we shouldn't laugh at it and think it's some sort of a big joke. Instead, we are told what we are to do relative to these things. I've got a couple of passages here and then we'll close. The first is in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 11. This is how we are to approach this. Paul says, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Don't have anything to do with this stuff. And in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 through 12 says, put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. You see, this stuff is not something that a Christian should have anything to do with. And if that means that you've got to turn out all the lights in the house and close the door and shut the shades, or get in the car and go somewhere else, and just to avoid it and stay away from it, then my suggestion is avoid it and stay away from it and have nothing to do with it. Now, I started this by letting you know that I'm just warning you. I can't control your lives and I can't live for you, but I can warn you. And now you've been warned. And if you start dipping in the pool and playing around and you get your hands spanked, understand that it's not going to fall on me. You've been warned. This is not a holiday that we should have anything to do with. Just like Christmas, just like Easter, this is one that we should avoid and have nothing to do with. And with that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention this morning. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.